This is Chapter 13, podcast number 2, Intellectual Hallmarks of the Italian Renaissance. In the first part of this chapter, we talked about the politics of Italy and how chaotic they were and turbulent, and lots of wars, invasions, and little city-states fighting among each other, and instability, and then they'd keep balance of power for a while, but that would only last for a short period, and then that would fall apart again. So against that backdrop of incredible difficulties and lack of unity and all the little city-states doing their own thing, the intellectual aspects of the Italian Renaissance really flourish amazingly. And this is the stuff that people remember about the Renaissance. This is the good stuff. That people forget about the politics, but this is the stuff that defines the Renaissance for what it was. The intellectual ideas that were debated and discussed and brought back. We start with Petrarch. Francesco Petrarca is an Italian poet who was the first man to invent the idea that there was a dark ages, that he referred to the Middle Ages, the 1,000-year period in history from the end of the Roman Empire till about his time, about 1350, as dark and barbarian, and he based that on the fact that German tribes destroyed the Roman Empire, and in his view, they destroyed learning and science and reason and architecture, and now it's time to bring it back. So he was one of the first people to think he was living in a new era. He didn't use the word Renaissance, but he described the concept pretty well. So we can trace a lot of this beginning of a new era to the ideas of Petrarch, again, an Italian poet who was the first to divide history conceptually into three periods. The classical period, which refers to Greek and Roman society. First the Greeks, then the Romans. This goes roughly about 1,000 BC to about 500 AD, the classical period. The Middle Ages then, roughly about 400 to 500 AD to about 1400 AD, about 1,000 years, he said, the Middle Ages, and he called them the Dark Ages. And then the third period of history, which now he says is starting right now, is the modern period, 1400 roughly and beyond. And this is all an intellectual construct. It's completely arbitrary. Most people's lives don't change at all. They don't wake up one morning and think, okay, now we're living in the Renaissance because a couple of guys are reading old books around me. He's a historian, Petrarch, and historians make up and construct periods of history for it to make sense around certain themes and topics. But if you were alive at the time, you wouldn't have noticed probably much around you, except for maybe a few buildings that look different and some people around you that you didn't know that were very upper class reading different books that maybe they hadn't read before. So this somewhat arbitrary division of time is kind of, we buy into it, we like it, because then we are part of the modern era. And I hope you see today in these three intellectual hallmarks that these three have really shaped modern society, and they are very different from the medieval view of humanity and of society. So you can debate, and people debate, was this arbitrary or not, but we usually stick with it. All right, the first intellectual hallmark of the Italian Renaissance is individualism. Individualism. Here we go. The medieval view of the individual, going back for a contrast here, is that man is supposed to be relatively anonymous. We're supposed to be humble. The medieval view emphasizes that people have sinned and fallen short back from the Garden of Eden, original sin. We're sinners by nature. At best, what we can hope for in life is to repent, become Christians, and go to heaven when we die. That's it. But life on earth is going to be a struggle. You need to keep your head down, work hard. Man is fallen and sinful and wicked, and don't think about yourself. You're not important. You're just sort of weak and in need of salvation. That's it. Your reward is later. No self-centeredness. Don't be proud. Don't take credit for things. Work hard. Reward is in the afterlife. The opposite view of humanity comes to pass in the Renaissance, which is celebrate individuality, celebrate who you are as a person, make a name for yourself, celebrate your own talents, your genius. These are words you'll want to write down. Your genius, your uniqueness, your own talent. It's okay to be good at something and famous. Totally opposite. And the scholars of the Renaissance that wrote about this shift looked back to Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, as the source of these new ideas that were old ideas, but that were bringing back, because Greek and Roman society valued individuals and accomplishing great things. But the medieval view for 1,000 years was dominated by a different point of view on humanity. Very, we would say, somewhat pessimistic. The writers of the Renaissance that really first put out this new thought were people like Leon Battista Alberti, who basically was a writer, an architect, a mathematician, a lot of things. His famous quote, "Man can do all things if they will," a very high opinion of mankind, very opposite of the medieval view, which is that man can do nothing outside of God. Benvenuto Cellini is another one of these early Italian writers that celebrates individualism. And he wrote about himself. People were very proud of themselves. He was a goldsmith and a sculptor, and he would write these long verses about himself and how, beauty and grace themselves in me fulfill, that I may surpass and to the best attain. So people were really striving for perfection, and they were talking about themselves in very important ways that people never had before. So to summarize all this, the individualism, it's about achievement, the quest for achievement, and doing it very publicly, seizing the day, seizing life. You only live once, you know that one, YOLO. Fame, ambition, talent, success, these things are to be celebrated and pursued. You need to be a well-rounded person. The term that we would come up with is l'uomo universale. You need to be a universal man, well-rounded, good at everything, and famous, and people should know you. And beyond that, you need to have the ability to influence the world around you. Virtu, virtu. That term is a Renaissance term that means you need to be able to influence the world around you, kind of at any means necessary, by any means that it takes. So whatever it takes. Be important, influence things, have charisma, power, make a name for yourself. I think we can relate to that in modern culture quite a bit. The second intellectual hallmark is humanism, also known as civic humanism. Same word, you'll hear a lot of synonyms for this. Civic humanism or humanism, same kind of thing. And this particular hallmark starts with the collection of documents. So the origins of humanism are that popes and medieval people were scouring Europe, collecting old ancient manuscripts and saving them. Anything Greek or Roman they could find, they wanted to keep, documents, and they wanted to build libraries. So for example, the popes of this period were building this Vatican library, this incredible library of thousands of medieval and ancient documents, and it was like a fad to collect old documents, particularly ancient classical documents, became the popular thing to do here in about 1400. Anyone that could get their hands on something old like this it was very popular and very important. And so what this leads to is the definition of humanism, which is an educational program where you study Greek and Roman literature, also known as the classics. We also call it Latin literature because most of it was written in Latin. And it's sort of a new program for learning. You don't always just study the Bible like you do in the Middle Ages. You study the Bible and ancient texts. So a man named Leonardo Bruni was very important in developing this concept of humanism and new learning. So it's an educational program that you would go through if you're if you're a wealthy man, particularly, and a woman too. It's a course. It's a studying of. You study the humanities. We would call it today. You study the humanities. You want to be well-rounded. You study the ancient texts. And it was required of you in order to be cultured and civilized. Again, you still study the Bible. You're still a Christian, but you start to look even further backward to study the classics. You read people like Cicero, Cicero, Ero, who was a great Roman historian and a senator from ancient Rome. And he would write these incredibly long treatises and just dialogues, and you want to learn Latin if you can to study this stuff. Now, this stuff from the classical world is not Christian. It's actually pagan, Pagan. That means non-Christian. But it became okay in the Renaissance to study not only the Bible, again, but these pagan texts and blend the two and take the best of both to define educational and intellectual studies. It's a quest to understand human nature. Why do we study all these ancient texts as a good humanist? To understand our own nature. Not necessarily the nature of God, human nature. And yet, as I said just a second ago, the humanists were still deeply Christian. It's not a rejection of God or of Christianity by any means. It takes Christianity and it tries to take what the ancient people before Christianity had discovered and harmonize the two. It's a really interesting concept. The most famous humanist maybe that tried to do this was Pico della Mirandola. Famous guy, Pico della Mirandola. We can call him Pico de Gallo. Pico della Mirandola, who wrote a book, The Oration on the Dignity of Man. And he sort of based this view of man not only on the Bible, but on the ancient world. And his view of man in this book, and we'll read this in class, is that there are really no limits to what man can accomplish. Man is the highest form of creation by God. God created man. We're better than the animals. We are redeemed. We are through being a Christian and being able to go to heaven. You can be redeemed of all your sin, and you can accomplish anything. A really lofty view of mankind. Again, the Greeks and Romans had that same view of mankind too, just minus the Christianity bit. So anyway, we'll read this in class and you'll see what he means. A very different conception of the individual from anyone that had come before him. And he's a humanist, Pico della Mirandola. The third intellectual hallmark is secularism. And we would define secularism today as being, not religious and this kind of thing. But in the Renaissance, the definition of secularism was a little bit different. It simply meant that people were interested in materialism, in acquiring wealth, focusing on the here and now, and not just the afterlife. Again, they're still deeply religious, but instead of focusing only on going to heaven someday, we have a life to live on earth, so let's live it well. Fine clothing, fine homes, furnishings, food, art particularly. The collection of art and the paying of art, patronage of art is going to become really popular. So how do these people get all this money, and where did all this idea about acquiring money come from? So usury is an important word. That's lending money at interest, so money lending, usury. And throughout all of the Middle Ages, money lending was seen as evil, and people pointed to various aspects of the Bible to justify why money lending was a sin. But then, around 1350, 1400, the views on usury changed. The Catholic Church actually loosened up a little bit on their teaching on usury, and the result was that millions of Christians, or at least hundreds of Christians, in the cities of Italy became bankers and money lenders. And they took over some of that profession from different groups that had practiced that in the past. So now it's sort of looked at okay for a Christian to be in banking and finance. And so these people in the city-states of Italy acquired tremendous wealth. And so what do you do with that wealth? You spend it. You consume things. You want to enjoy life. Leisure time becomes more important. Art and entertainment. This is important. And you show it off a little bit. You have the biggest house in the city of Florence, let's say, or you can get a famous artist to build your family chapel or decorate it with art, or even more, build your tomb someday, your grave, and sculpt it. These important things that people want. Lorenzo Valla is a name that is associated with the development of secularism, who wrote a book on pleasure that says our five senses are really what we ought to focus on. The five senses that we have, marks the supreme aspect of life. Giovanni Boccaccio, we wrote the Decameron. That book was where we learned about the plague. This book is filled with characters that are more concerned with collecting money and possessions than anything else. They're very worldly characters in this book. So how much does the church fight against this, the Catholic Church? Really, not at all. The Catholic Church is part of the process of becoming materialistic. It's the Pope that changes the teaching on usury. Renaissance popes, we'll call them that. These guys like Julius II, they're just as worldly and rich as everybody else, and they're encouraging this new spirit. They want to build the finest cathedrals. These guys are going to build private chapels like the Sistine Chapel, the most famous chapel in the world with Renaissance art frescoes on the ceiling. That's paid for by the popes. They build a new massive cathedral for themselves, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome at the Vatican. This is the centerpiece of the Catholic Church. All this is paid for with incredible wealth, and they hire the finest craftsmen and artists to do it. Michelangelo, Raphael, these guys work for the popes. So the secularism spirit sort of pervades even the religious aspect, even the religious community in Europe. Everybody's interested in this. Live a good life now and then go to heaven later. Look at this inside of St. Peter. It's just incredible. This takes money and lots of it. But don't forget, overall, Christianity and being religious still dominates people's thinking. These are not atheists. People are deeply religious, deeply Christian. This is evidenced by the fact that most Renaissance art is actually of religious subject matter. There's thousands of works of art from the Renaissance that are deeply religious, but it's the combination of living a good life now and then the afterlife as well that makes this a unique period in history.